Hello and welcome. I'm going to try to explain exponential growth to you in my own way, and I'll start with a puzzle. So you find a lamp, give it a rub, and out pops a genie. He says you have two options. I can either give you £1,000,000 today, or I'll give you 1 pence today, and I'll come back tomorrow, give you 2 pence. The following day 4 pence, and I'll keep doing this until the end of the month. So the big question is, which of those two options is the best one to pick? So looking in Excel, let's have a look at what would happen day on day. First day, 1 pence, 2 pence, 4 pence, 8 pence. By the time you get to day 11, you got just over 1,000 pennies. By the time you get to day 21, you got 1,000,000 pennies. By the time you get to day 31, he's going to give you 1,000,000,000 pennies. That's £10 billion worth, and a total of £21,000,000, £474,000 of pennies. Cashier's going to hate you for taking those into the bank, but I'd go for that option. Hopefully that demonstrates how small numbers can become very big very quickly through exponential growth. So the truth is you rarely see true exponential growth in real life. There'll be some kind of limitation such as the population size. So I've got a math site open here. It's showing the difference between exponential growth and logistic growth. So the key difference being exponential growth continues to grow indefinitely, whereas logistic growth will see a curve which is more of an S shape when you look at the total number of people infected, number of people hospitalised, number of people that recovered, number of people that died. So the difference between these formulas is basically the one term here, which is the K minus N over K. So K is a carrying capacity. That's basically the most people that can possibly be either infected or hospitalised, died, whatever you happen to be measuring. And N is a number of people to date who have already been infected, hospitalised, gone on to die, gone on to recover, etc. So what you can say is that when N is 0 or close to 0, this term is effectively equal to 1. K minus 0 over K is 1. So you end up with Rmax multiplied by N, which is the same as the exponential growth curve. When N is a small fraction of K, then the same is also true, although K minus N will not be the same as K, it will be close to it, so this term will be close to 1. So when people say exponential growth in terms of a pandemic, what they're talking about is the exponential-like phase of the growth early on. It's effectively the same value that it will come up with, but just being pedantic, it's not exponential growth as in on the left-hand side where it will continue to rise forever. So one of the things you may have heard of recently is the SIR model, which is the Susceptible, Infectious and Recovered model. It's the most primitive form of epidemiological modelling, but it's a basis on which all of the more advanced models are built. So the general principle is people are susceptible. They will then become infectious if they become infected, and then they will go on to either recover or they'll go on to die. And if you were to plot the number of people infectious over time, you've got the maroon colour here. So the number increases slowly at first, increases rapidly for a point, reaches an inflection point. The growth rate then flips from what was positive to negative. You then reach a peak, and then it will drop off slowly over time at a somewhat slower rate than it increased initially. So if you also plot for the same time period the number of people susceptible, starts with the full population, reduces over time as people become infected, and then it will plateau near to 0 once pretty much everyone's infected. And the final category is the recovered. And if you look at it from starting at 0, slowly increases over time, increases rapidly, hits the inflection point where the growth rate goes from positive to negative, and then it will increase to the point where it starts to level off and plateau close to the whole population, having been either through the disease and recovered or gone on to die. So the main takeaway from this is that you would expect to see some kind of an S shape in epidemic curves. So when we look at Italy, for example, we see the total number of deaths over time from February through to September following an S shape where it started at 0, increased over time, slowed, plateaued, and then levelled off. Spain was a similar story. Through February and March it started to increase, and then it started plateauing. Through summer it's been relatively level, and they're starting to see a rise in deaths now. If you scroll down to daily deaths, you can see that that's happening, albeit nowhere near as bad as it was in March or April yet. France is a very similar story, another S shape, so we see where it increased over time, levelled off and plateaued. And if we look at the United Kingdom, same story again. We see how it started at 0, increased over time, levelled off, plateaued, And the big question is what's going to happen next. I created this chart on the 19th of March. I'd noticed by analysing the data between Italy and the UK, looking at the number of daily deaths and the associated growth rates, that the UK was lagging behind Italy by about 2 weeks. So I created this graph. It just simply shifts the UK data by 2 weeks, overlays the two countries. So what we're seeing is the data up to the 19th of March for both the UK and for Italy. So whilst Italy was seeing about 450 deaths per day at the 19th of March, back in the UK we were seeing about 45 or so deaths. It was simply lagging behind Italy by the 14 days that I mentioned. So it's worth mentioning that the number of deaths on a daily basis is really a window on the number of people being infected 3 weeks prior. So we now know that the average time between infection and dying is 3 weeks. So when you're looking at data for the 19th of March in terms of how many people are dying, these people on average were dying in the last few days of February. Infected in the last few days of February. Likewise, these people in the UK, although I've shifted the numbers, it's still the number of people who were infected in late February and gone on to develop severe illness and gone on to die. So my hypothesis at the time was that given it was showing the same growth rates and showing the same trend as Italy, and we hadn't seen any significant change in behaviours in the UK between the end of February and the middle of March, I suspected that we were going to see the same kind of trajectory as we'd seen in Italy. So I carried on studying this for the next few months. I included Italy, Spain, France and the UK in the comparison. I was basically recording the number of daily deaths, comparing the growth rates. I aligned the three countries based on when they saw their first 10,000 deaths, and what's quite clear is how similar these four countries are. Despite the fact that they're somewhat different, they do have striking similarities, the population sizes being very similar, the average age being very similar, despite what people may say. And also we all had our national lockdowns in some shape or form. So if you look at that same data based on population size, you'll see that again, Italy and the UK are very similar, the blue and the green line. France was not dissimilar, albeit they did seem to recover a bit quicker at one point. Spain seemed to have the worst of the peaks. But I'm not trying to point fingers at anyone, say who did or didn't handle this best or worst. It's simply making an observation that we had very similar epidemiological curves. So if we go back to the previous slide and look how this relates to the 19th of March I was talking about. So on 19th of March, Italy, which is in green, was seeing about 450 daily deaths. The UK, on the other hand, was seeing about 45 daily deaths and seemed to be tracking Italy. That subsequently did turn out to be the case. Clearly, Italy wasn't yet at their inflection point. It was starting to become evident, and then they carried on growing for a while, got to the peak, and then started to decrease. So this brings us back to the question of what's likely to happen next. And besides the uncertainty, we do have lots of data available that we didn't have available in March. So we can learn from what we saw in March. We can see how quickly things grow, and we can look for similar signs at this point in time. Now, it's worth noting that the number of cases being detected is very, very deceptive at this point in time. I did a video on it and explained how the increase in testing makes it really difficult to compare the number of cases now to what we saw back in March. So the best data we can use right now is the number of daily hospitalisations. I covered this topic in my second video where I was saying how the number of hospitalisations had been reducing over time through the year, but come the 22nd of August we saw a turning point. The number of daily hospitalisations has been increasing since then, gradually at first. The growth rate has increased day on day, and we're currently seeing about 8 or 9% growth each day. So each day we see 9% more hospitalisations than we saw on the previous day. So looking at the death data as well, I'll do a video on this later in the week, but I think there is evidence to suggest that we're also seeing the number of daily deaths is also starting to increase, slightly lagging behind the hospitalisations. I'll cover that later in the week. So this brings us back to what the government's trying to do. Well, it's really quite straightforward. Although the numbers are quite low right now, they're definitely increasing. The number of daily cases, the number of daily hospitalisations, and even the number of daily deaths. The doubling time in late February and early March was about 3 or 4 days. Currently it's about 7 or 8 days, and we clearly can't let things carry on the way they are. I think it's safe to say that most people don't want further restrictions, local lockdowns, or even a national lockdown. Best thing we can do to avoid that is just take measures ourselves to try to reduce the risk of transmission and do it of our own choice. The alternative, we're going to have lockdown enforced on us. Your choice.